Good evening, sir. Today, we will going to discuss my report about the perception of gender and sexuality. So first, let us know what is the perception of gender and sexuality. Recent work in the third wave of social linguistic variation, according to Eckert 2012, has focused on how speakers use variation to build social constructs, including gender and sexual identity. So here, this focus on how we think or understand what gender and sexuality all about, to know what speakers' gender and sexuality identity. Next is core work in perception, the search for gay speech. This literature on the social linguistic perception of gender and sexuality, according to Munson and Babel 2007, has had a narrower focus than the larger field of language, gender, and sexuality. That is according to Great 2016, Jacobs 1996, Kolick 2000, Podesva and Kahino 2014. A majority of this work has involved around the question of gay or sounding gay. So the Coren's perception, the search for gay speech. This deals on how to identify the person's identity by searching some speech to test on how they speak or pronounce the word. By how they deliver them, we will know what are their classifications in society. So next, expanding beyond English gay speech. The focus on how English-speaking men's voices are perceived has overwhelmingly dominated the literature on the social linguistic perception of sex and gender. Some work, however, explored other languages, the other evaluations, listeners' variability, and intersections between multiple variables. Next is the challenging a binary view of gender. Recent study of language, gender, and sexuality have begun to consider the role and flows of the gender binary in social linguistic research. But the binary remains a central and often unquestioned construct in much perception work. So here, the study of language, gender, and sexuality are broad. You can say that it is broad. That's why there are so many methods or tests to know their classifications and where they really belong. So later we will know there are some methods to test the if where they are really belong. Next is the intersection of race and gender. The framework of intersectionality is the key for the perception of gender and sexuality. That is according to Crenshaw 1991, pointed out that where oppressive structure intersect, the combined effects on lived experience may differ according from the effects if only one of those structure, for example, the differences on how black women and white women experience sexism and gendered violence. So later, there are some methods that we will know if how they will see or how they will differentiate some difference women in our society, the black and the white. Current study. To conceptualize gender social linguistic behavior without relying on a binary structure and without neglecting intersectional effects, we turn to key third wave theoretical tools, namely styles and personae. So here, styles are clusters of linguistic and non-linguistic semiotic resources such as phonetic cues, lexical items, clothing, and makeup practices, or body hexes, which are tied to each other and particular places and times, and which signify sets of social meanings such as group identities. They also include personae, which are similarly clustered sets of resources through which individual create situationally appropriate selves, so that a single person might present their professional doctor in one context and prezi diva in another. That is according to Podesva 2007. Personae are necessarily developed in communication with broadly circulating characterological figures or personhood, such as Valley Girl, football star, or distinguished professor. That is according to Aga 2007. So next here, these are some the methods. So here we can see the ratings. Our first goal in analyzing the ratings was to note the differences in how listener approached the task, and to better understand how these differences illuminate the gendered ideologies which shape the process of person perception. Our focus was on the relationship between gay and masculine ratings, since the literature has struggled with these responses task and their connection. On the one hand, both previous literature and non-academic discussion have stressed the importance of disentangling gendered self-presentation and sexual orientation or patterns of preference. In the simplest terms, it is not only possible but common for gay men to self-present with cues coded as masculine, and for straight men to self-present with cues coded as feminine. Whether linguistic example or non-linguistic example, the body hexes. Perceptual work, however, has found that a majority of evaluations show correlations between these conceptuality distinct axes. This is according to Smith 2003. Observe that their results showed a strong correlation between the two scales, but preferred ranges used by listeners differed. They suggested on that basis that the two responses reflect distinct perceptual constructs despite their close correlation. More intriguingly, they found that while neither masculine, feminine scores nor straight or gay scores were predicted by pitch, and difference between the two scales was. Higher pitched voice showed a close correlation between the two ratings, while responsible to lower pitched voice were more likely to allow for higher gay ratings alongside more masculine ratings. That is according to Munson 2007. He also said that differentiated between the two constructs, suggesting that they may be tied to be different acoustic factors, although he notes that the evidence in his study for this occasion is stronger for male than female talkers. As a result, we turn first the responses for these two scales. This distribution are shown in figures 4.1 and 4.2. So this is the example of the ratings. In these graphs, we can see several general trends. First, a clear bias towards the high end and the masculine scales shows that the listeners are responding to the reports of the talkers to sound as masculine as possible. Consistent with previous research on the negative associations between the scales, gay ratings are concentrated on the low end of the scale. In addition to this overall contribution, we see a few marked peaks, which disrupt the otherwise relatively smooth distribution. These appear to consist the listeners opting out of the rating task for these scales. We followed that first author established practice of using an unnumbered scales that discourage use to the middle of the scale as a pseudo-neutral answer. However, the use of verbal responses to the highly familiar 1 to 10 scales appears to have defeated the goals. With 5 perceived by listeners as a midpoint of respondents, 16% out of 38 answered 5 for a gay rating of all three speakers. suggesting that despite not being the mathematical middle of the scale offered, they perceive 5 as a neutral response to the question. Next. For all participants with variability in both scales, the correlation between the items gay and masculine was calculated based on the 3 ratings each listeners completed. The histogram of the metric of shown in figure 4.3, based on the distribution, these listeners were divided into the categories strongly negative, moderately negative, flat, and positive, with the boundaries indicated on the graph. This measure was used to capture the diversity of listeners' pre-existing understanding of gender and sexuality, and how those understanding interact with the performances they hear. The majority of listeners display the commonly seen negative association, where high gay ratings responded to low masculine ratings. However, listeners vary along this dimension, with a substantial minority reversing the trend. Gender had no effect on this distribution, but black listeners showed significantly less of a connection between gay ratings and lowered masculine ratings compared to the white listeners, with listeners of other racial identities falling between in these two, not differing significantly from each other. Next. Although calculated in 7 dimensions for the 7 rating items, the cluster can easily be summarized into 2 dimensions as shown in figure 4.4. This is due to the similarity of profile of feminine, masculine, and gay straight, and the similarity of all 5 of other items. In this essentially two-dimensional space, the 4 cluster captured 2 high masculine and 2 moderately masculine percepts, where each other consists of 1 more positive, more educated, kinder, more thoughtful, more outgoing, and more energetic, and 1 more negative characterization. Discussion. This study offers a few points for that perception literature. First, it shows the perception of performative hypermasculinity shows a very simplistic perceptual structure focused around 2 dimensions: the degree of masculinity, and general positive negative assessment. Second, it shows that individual listeners to differ the ideological structure underlying their perception, particularly with respect to the link between gender, performance, and sexuality. While the majority of listeners display the hegemonic pattern linking gay men to less masculine gendered performances, this is not the case of all listeners. Black participants differing pattern assessment of gayness and masculineness in our sample suggests that racial identity and likely other axes of social identification can influence the perception of gender and sexuality in meaningful ways. Put another way, as intersections of identity structure, linguistic production, so to do they permeate perception. Finally, this data shows little support for any specific acoustic cues used by listeners. This suggests either the listeners are growing on cues not covered in the previous literature, or that different listeners are responding to different cues, leaving each individual cue without strong support. They also include personae, which are similarly clustered sets of resources through which individuals create situational appropriate selves, so that a single person might present their professional doctor in one context and prison diva in another. That is according to Podeswa 2007. So, our next topic is all about the gender diversity and the voice. Recent years have seen unprecedented visibility for transgender people and issues, and scholars of language are increasingly interested in exploring the ways gender diversity is manifested on the linguistic level. Attention to the linguistic consequences of gender diversity demands not only the inclusion of transgender and gender nonconforming speakers in social linguistic research, but also a shift in how the field thinks about gender and sex, especially when it comes to the voice. Sex, gender, and sexuality as multidimensional scales, sex and distinction between sex as a system of classifying bodies and gender. As a system for classifying the social practices, dispositions, and experiences are associated with one sex or another is well established in social linguistics. Gender part of how sex and gender are naturalized is through the appearance of total continuity between an individual body, identity, style of presentation, and how they perceive by others. However, the study of non-normative genders requires a distinction between different elements of gender and sex, and goes beyond what is typically found in social linguistic research. So, the research on gender and the voice. The gendered voice, like the sex of the body, is often treated as a single dimension, despite the fact that it is composed of a number of distinguishable features. Most phonetic research on gender in the voice assumes that difference between women's and men's voices emanate directly from the anatomical consequences of membership in one and two sex categories. That is in the review of Zeman 2008. From theory to analysis. As an illustration of how a multidimensional model of gender might be employed to examine a diverse set of gender identities, the remainder of this character chapter focuses on an analysis of S in a group of English speakers speaking transgender people recorded between 2010 and 2014 in and around San Francisco, CA, and Portland, OR. From theory to analysis. As an illustration of how a multidimensional model of gender might be employed to examine a diverse set of gender identities, the remainder of this chapter focuses on an analysis of S in a group of English-speaking transgender people. So the table 5.2, the number of speaker by gender assignment, identity, and sexuality. This analysis presents results from 32 transgender speakers, 15 of whom were assigned female at birth, and 17 of whom were assigned male. The speakers' self-described gender identities, assignments, and sexualities are represented in Table 5.2. Among the AMAB, or shall we say the female at birth, speakers, 12 identified as women and 5 with a non-binary category among the AFAB speakers, which is the women at birth. 9 identified as men and 6 as non-binary. Table 5.2 also reports the self-identified sexual orientations of speakers. However, the number of speakers per cell were too small and imbalanced to include sexuality in the statistical analysis of this sample. Notably, some combination of sexualities and gender are unlikely to pair together, example, straight and non-binary. So next is the table 5.3. This is the result of linear regression model number 1. The result of linear mixed effects regression analysis indicate that center of gravity for S differs according to both gender identity and gender assignment in this sample. As table 5.3 shows, the intercept estimate of 8,459 for the trans women has estimated as being 1,827 lower for the trans men and 199 lower for non-binary speakers when all of the non-binary speakers are lumped together without regards to assigned sex. Speakers who were assigned male at birth were also estimated as a whole to have lower COG than the female assigned speakers. However, as the more detailed analysis to follow demonstrate, this difference was driven largely by the non-binary speakers. Notably, given the intercept of 8,459 for the women and 6,632 for the men, both AFAB and AMAB speakers display a relatively high frequency relative to reference values reported for women and men. In studies of American English using comparable method, the Zeeman 2017, the group-based ANOVA, or shall we say ANOVA, comparisons indicate that the trans women and trans men and the male assigned non-binary speakers all had lower centers of gravity than the non-binary individuals who were assigned female at birth. There was no statistically significant difference between the trans women and the trans men. The trans women and the AMAB non-binary speakers, or the trans men and the AMAB non-binary speakers in table 5.4 and 5.5 contain results from the ANOVA model, which uses a collapsed variable for gender identity and assign in order to facilitate group-by-group comparisons. Figure 5.1 shows the result for centre of gravity according to gender grouping. The figure, like the ANOVAs, sorts speaker into 4 categories based on the intersection of gender assignment and identity: trans male, AFAB non-binary, AMAB non-binary, and trans female. Most of the findings are well represented in this image. The AFAB non-binary speakers tend to be higher than the trans men, and the AMAB speakers tend to be than the AFAB speakers. The AMAB non-binary speakers also have the narrower distribution than the trans women speakers, perhaps due to the smaller number of speakers in the former groups. So this is the result of Turkey HSD post-hoc disking on ANOVA model number 1. This result indicates that both gender assignment and gender identity matter. When it comes to gender assignment, it seems that the socialization experiences trans people have early in life may exert an influence on their social linguistic styles in adulthood. That said, it is worth highlighting that this difference is driven in large part of the non-binary speakers, given that there is no statistically significant difference between the trans women and trans men. Speakers do not merchantistically enact in gender norms ascribed to them. There are some room for individuals to push back against the realization message they receive. After all, trans people are defined as those who do not identify with a gender that their socialization experiences were, as a whole, designed to produce. As Butler in 1990 and other post-structuralist feminists have argued, agency and resistance against the gender order can be observed in the endless iteration of gender that one must perform, creating the possibility for those iterations to shift gender in new directions. In this sense, the potential for individual agency can be observed through the analysis of gendered practices in which gender diverse speakers engage. Although the trans women speakers tend to have relatively high contrast of gravity for S, there is a cluster for tokens in the data from the trans women that fall on low ends of this data, far lower than any of the speakers from the other groups, including the AMAB and non-binary individuals. Lastly is the conclusion. This chapter has laid out a theory of sex and gender that complicates widely used methods and commonly held theoretical assumptions in sociophonetic by highlighting the multidimensionality of these aspects of the self. And that's all. Thank you.